guys. It's Barry Ryan here. We'll be starting in 10 minutes. So 9:45 is kind of to try to get you guys to register. And I think it's going to be an exciting morning in economics, right? You know, when I was your age, it was very difficult to see how I could understand all these theoretical concepts. So perhaps, I wouldn't say an upside to COVID, but we'll explore today the economics of the impact of COVID. Okay, so I'll start off with a bit of theory in about 10 minutes, and then what we'll do is we'll look at the data. Okay? It's so dry, some of this economics, especially the macroeconomics, and one thing to try and get a good grade in this subject is to realize that you kind of have to connect to the data. Okay? It's an empirical subject, just like physics. The mathematics might be beautiful, but in physics, unless the mathematics describes reality, it's just mathematics. Okay? And similarly for economics. But I look forward to this. What I'll be doing is I'll give an introduction at the beginning to what they call the circular flow of national income, and then after that, I'll transfer to my iPad, like an old man like me, connecting my iPad to some of the technology we've put together here, and hopefully that will work for you guys. And hopefully we'll make the Central Statistics Office data more real for you guys. Okay, so we'll see you in about let's see, old man, put on my glasses. Where are they? My glasses. Where are they? But I honestly feel that once you start understanding this data, you'll begin to realize that the subject is smaller than it looks. But if you don't connect with the data, you can't get a H1. Where did I do my glasses? Now, when I say I love this subject, I adore it, only because you can make so many easy gains very, very quickly, okay? Right. So, in a few minutes we'll start. It's now, let's see, it's 9:52, so we have 9:45 for registration at 10 a.m., and then we proceed at 10, okay? The only thing is, unfortunately, some of you might come to my classes already, realize I talk too much. So usually I mute myself, especially my maths classes or HVAC classes, because if I don't mute myself, I keep on talking. It's an old man disease. Right? Okay, so, but I look forward to this, and I think it's actually going to be quite exciting. Okay, so I'll give you guys a few minutes to see if you link in, and then we'll get crack on, as they say. We'll crack on. Putting in my chargers. As anybody who has an iPad realizes, they run down their battery quite quickly. Okay. But I'm really looking forward to this because I don't know, I wouldn't say exciting, but maybe I can make it more exciting than the textbook. The textbook is very, very good, but a bit of a yawn. See, I don't know who's logged in or not, right? Okay, because this is all, you know, free to air. So we'll see how it goes. But while we wait, I would just like to put, now some of you haven't done economics probably since March 12th, give or take. It's a very hard subject. It's one of those subjects where I think students overcomplicate it, okay, especially at the insert level. Like at the moment, I've got some students who are doing their masters in UL in economics who are coming to me just giving them guidance, etc. Right, helping them write little mathematical models in economics. But the underlying concepts are the exact same. So before we start, now some of you've probably all done microeconomics, okay? And this macroeconomics can confuse. This morning, what I want to do is talk about data. Because remember, as I said earlier, it's an empirical subject. So your macroeconomics, to get by in the exam, what are the basics you need to know? Okay. Well, you need to know this concept of national income. Okay. And associated with that are factors of production. That's something that I think. You know, a couple of years ago I had a student and she said to me, she went from getting like 40% to 85% in her exams. Because she said to me, oh Barry, I thought factors of production were micro. In this course, there isn't that much of there's an overlap between micro and macro, and there should be, right? Okay. Macroeconomics is about large-scale populations and the way they react to economic stimuli, right? Okay, sounds like a mouthful. So we need to know national income. And also we need to know how we measure it. Students who come to me, how we measure national income. Okay. So it's kind of two separate subjects. One is the underlying theoretical concepts of how the wealth of a nation or the income of a nation is calculated over a certain period of time, like a year. And then the other thing is how we measure it. Because, you know, this would be ridiculous unless we were able to measure things. And one thing is to realize that measuring is kind of like garbage. Okay, okay, so, but it's the best we can do. And usually the source we use there is the CSO, the Centre for Statistics. If any of this sounds new to you, do not in any way fret or worry, okay? And on top of that, we need goals of, these are new pens, it's very annoying. Then we have this concept of goals of government. That should be easy enough to understand, you know. What does government want in an economy? Remember, we live in a democracy, supposedly. So every few years we vote in or out different political parties. And the different political parties will have different economic agenda. Okay? So Sinn Féin might regard tax the rich, which depends on your viewpoint. Another political philosophy might be, if we allow the rich to invest, then that creates employment. So we're constantly, in one way to think about Western democracies, United States, France, Germany, Britain, Spain, Italy, etc., is we're constantly repeating an economic experiment. Okay. Now everything that underlying everything here, guys, underlying everything will be the concept of scarcity. And what are goals of government? Now let me spend about 10 minutes on this, and then we'll go to the how COVID-19 has impacted the economy. And we'll start off with an equilibrium. Again, this might sound strange to some of you. The end of 2019, because that's the last time, that's the only good data we have on GDP, right? On GDP. So goals of government are economic growth. Get rid of that pen. So expensive, these pens. Nice, they don't work. Very annoying. Goals of government will be economic growth. And you'll see shortly, without economic growth, what's the point? Economic development. Again, that sounds so dry, etc. But two good examples that some of you might come to my classes already realizes economic development would be, how do we distribute the wealth? If a country is doing well, like Brazil, how come there's so many poor people, right? How come the rich seem to get richer and the poor just are thrown onto the garbage heap of humanity? It's a huge problem for our civilization. So economic development, what would be two good examples there? I won't write them down. Well, in Britain and Ireland, just say post-World War II, so say about 1945 onwards, it was universal access to healthcare. Because how can you have a population that produces economic growth unless they're healthy? What was the other great thing was free access to education. That's probably one of the healthcare of education, probably the reasons why I'm able to stand in front of the camera today and speak to you. Because I would have been a recipient or a beneficiary of economic development. Right? Now, it becomes quite controversial, like a party like Fine Gael might regard giving tax breaks to rich or to rich corporations. That's what we do in Ireland and in other countries. And how do we? But economic development can't occur without economic growth. If you're Fine Gael or Fianna Fáil, etc., how do you get re-elected 5 years later? You want, it's a very tricky concept here, full employment. Honestly guys, this exam, see I always regard my job is to take a very, very hard course and truncate it. It's still difficult, but make it smaller. Okay? Full employment. And then we have this concept of natural unemployment. So you're not going to get elected unless you make sure that, just say your parents might be in their mid-40s, right? Their kids are in their late teens. You'll vote for a party that actually makes you feel happy, but also make sure your kids get an opportunity in life economically. So full employment will be a goal of government. What else would be a goal of government? Stable prices. Okay? And that links to your inflation. And throughout all this will be government policy. If this sounds dry, I don't blame you. Okay? Government policy. In other words, how do we spend the money? They're usually tax receipts, aren't they? And we'll see it, we'll make it more live later on in this course, in this morning. If you understand all these, now then we've got very, very dry definitions in here, full employment, stable prices, this is the do with inflation, okay? But if these two come up, they're usually quite repetitive. You know, I tend to be, I'm very lazy, right? I'm very, very lazy, so my viewpoint on things would be, how little do I need to know to get away with it, right? And I hope this is okay, but I always expect you guys to get H1s. Right? I'm not saying you will, it's just, I just think that's a good goal, right? So, but how do you get H1 without making it too lingo intensive, too technobabble, okay? But doesn't that make sense? But if you look at these four goals of government, 1, 2, 3, 4, how do we get economic growth? It means we have to sell things, isn't that right? We have to produce things that people want. Okay. Right? So, somebody just texted me to say they didn't get a link for the right. I think that makes sense. Let's keep it very, very simple. You know, before, in our little country, an open economy, a very small open economy. Right. So, what Leo Varadkar was the Prime Minister, wasn't he? On Taoiseach. Right. See, without economic growth, he couldn't deliver on the others. Okay? So ultimately, all this depends on economic growth. And we'll be seen later on how this all works. Now, what do we mean by factors of production? And again, I have to admit, I'm going to try and make this as simple as possible. We have a toy model of the economy, and it's a toy. Make sure that it doesn't. I'm only looking at the cameras. The screen is over there, and the camera's here. But I keep on looking at the screen to make sure that I'm not writing over the going outside the bounds. Okay. Well, what's a toy model of the economy? Well, we have households. Okay. Ultimately, the wealth of a nation belongs to households. Sounds weird. You think it belongs to the big state or to the ESB or Ministry of Finance. But no, ultimately the households own all the wealth in the country, okay? And then we have firms. Very strange concept here, and it's very, I wouldn't say badly explained in the books. The books are very good. It's just that they're a bit of a yawn. Okay, right, so ultimately, in an advanced economy like ours, let me just get different colour pens now a second. What we have is households buy goods and services from firms. That's basically what we do every day. If you suit your parents just over dinner tonight or a lunch or whatever, if you're going back to school, you say to your mum and dad, how many different products do you buy every week? You know, from bread to milk to household cleaners. My brother came to visit me yesterday in Limerick, and after he came to visit us and had a cup of tea, he was going to go off and get his car washed. So that's a product you're buying, a service, isn't it, right? Some of you might have gone to a matinees or Eason's in order to buy your school textbooks in the new year. It's a constant exchange of goods and services, okay? Here you're not paying for this morning. This is kind of like, I think it's a great idea, as discussed with my principal, Judy Martin, that we, I don't know, give you guys a bit of a nudge back into the academic year. So constantly, we're buying goods and services. So I could imagine your parents, if they actually sat down, you said to them, how many products or services you buy a week? And I'd say they'd be astonished by how much, okay? And our little toy economy, households are you guys, me, you, your parents, and firms are this kind of like theoretical concept. Okay. They're the ones who produce. And why do firms sell household goods and services? In exchange for something like, let's call it income. We have to be very careful here because if you come to my classes in 6th year or 5th year, what you realize is, in fact, we could say money, couldn't we? But we have to be careful about money. Now that's how it works. But where do the households get the income or the resources, the limited resources, in order to compensate the firms for the goods and services? What they do is they exchange factors of production. Right? That's why these factors of production here, guys, right, lie in both micro and macro. So what happens is, these guys, for the income, they swap factors of production. And in exchange for that, they get a return. Please, an awful lot of kids come to me, and they seem to be okay in 5th year, and then in 6th year, it kind of falls apart. Okay. Because, honestly, when I was your age, when I pick up the textbooks, they're very well written, they're beautifully written, they're very accurate, but they're so tedious. I have to admit, so tedious, okay guys? So tedious. So, and what are the returns of factor of production? What are the factors of production in our economy? Well, what do we have? We have land, probably the most slippery. Labour, easy. Capital, easy once you get used to it. And enterprise, from an exam point of view, the simplest. Okay? So what we assume in our toy model is the households own all those 4 factors of production. Right? It's kind of funny about economics. It's actually quite a leveler because it kind of removes that concept of them and us. Okay, we are them, and they are us. Okay? And what are the returns of those four factors of reduction? Even if you haven't done this in class yet, because I know you've been out of school since March 12th. What are the returns of factor reduction? For land, it's rent. For labour, it's wages. For capital, it's interest. And for enterprise, it's profit. It's something I would have found difficult to understand. See, the firms sit on the right. Right? And by the way, drawing this graph here could be 20 out of 4, still waiting for complete clarification on the new exam structure. But I think it's going to follow the old one quite closely. The only thing is they want a kind of a deeper understanding of economic principles rather than just regurgitating quotation. The interesting thing here is, and I would have found this difficult, is you can imagine someone like to say Mark Zuckerberg, who set up Facebook when he was at Harvard University. To date women, basically, to be honest with you guys. And then become one of the largest capitalized firms on earth. We assume Mark Zuckerberg is a household. Bill Gates, who set up Microsoft out of his garage. We assume Bill Gates is a household. Maybe close to home, someone like J.P. McManus, he's a household. So see, the profits belong to the households, not to all households, okay? I was doing this kind of calculation for my master's students at UL. In fact, and households basically, households own the firms through pension, private pensions, independent of the state pension. And now it is true that about 60% of the Irish population do not have private pensions. But the interesting thing is, in the group over 45 years of age, 70% own private pensions to supplement their pension plan in the future. And what do they own through that? Many different assets, but what they own is equity. So they own Facebook, they own all the rest of it. So we in our simple model, the households own all the factors of production. Okay? Now, again, I don't want to spend too much time in theory, because I want to show you, I think the numbers speak for themselves. A guy called Keynes, very pompous man, by the way, very pompous, very arrogant man, but he revolutionized economics in the 1930s. Keynes came up with this kind of like liquidity preference theory. So what do households face, just like firms do? They face scarcity. So you have needs and wants. Needs are like shelter, food, water, heat, right? Wants are, like, I want to go to Bermuda, right? Okay, or I want a Mercedes Benz, or, right? I want the latest PlayStation, or the latest Jimmy Choo shoes or something. So we have needs and wants. And this is where I find, in my experience, students find it difficult. So what is the fundamental economic problem? It's finite resources, infinite wants, right? Wants and needs are satisfied. But that's not quite the whole story, you see. Like I joke with my students, I'm an old man. So 3 olds, not 4. Right? Okay, so as I got older, see, when I was in my 20s and 30s, I'd go, like that Ferrari. I haven't been to Rome. I like that little hotel in Paris and in the Marais. So I'd spend, consume. As I got a bit older, and what happens if things go wrong? Right? Okay. You start just being a rational person. You start going, geez, if I survive to 80, how am I going to live? Okay, so I started to put some of my return on rent, wages, interest, and profit into savings. Okay, and where do I put that savings? In our little toy economy. I put them into financial institutions. So everything here on the left will be a leakage. Now, if you haven't done this in school, don't worry, you must do it. So it's probably the best idea to just get a bit of a, let's call it, these are all leakages on the left, okay? Why do I want to save? For a rainy day? Also, for instance, at the moment, we'll see shortly, when I bring this through the COVID-19 impact on the economy, we'll see that savings have gone up. Intimately linked to this concept of inflation. But guys, it's kind of like when I was a kid, like I remember being a Boy Scout. I know, so geeky. But we'd go. I think when I was 13 or something, we had to climb, I don't know, some mountain or some hill. So we're at the bottom, and I turned to the scoutmaster and I went, "How far do we have to go?" And it was a he, and he said to me, "Oh, it's about an hour climb, and we're done." I said, "No. An hour later, we're having lunch." I said, "We're done now, are we? Can we go back down?" He goes, No, it's another hour to the top. I just said an hour for lunch. Hour until we have lunch." And I went, I didn't like that at all. I just would have preferred at the beginning, he said, it's a 2-hour climb. So at least so what I'm doing here is actually potentially the framework for 50% of the marks in section B, as long as they don't change the exam structure once again. Right? Okay. So theoretically in economics, all things being equal, we say if I save and I don't consume, that's going to impact the economy negatively. So that's financial institutions. Okay. And we'll be seeing this shortly. And I think taking this little theoretical model and showing each part of it from an actual data point of view, empirically. What do financial institutions do with our savings? And remember, these are all households in the economy like Ireland. Well, the financial institutions might decide to invest. So firms might decide to make investment, and we call that capital I, and that depends on the interest rate that financial institutions earn. I'm not going to go too much on that, and also expectations of the future. So I always use this example. Over the last couple of years, what I've noticed, I've lived in London and Tokyo, Hong Kong, Los Angeles for many years. I'm certainly retired to Ireland. But what I've noticed over the last few years, in Limerick City at least, where I live, is along O'Connell Street, the places you can go for a cup of coffee or a sandwich have become fancier and fancier and fancier and fancier. That would be our investment. And the expectations are, because there's such a high concentration of multinational corporations in the west coast of Ireland, that and so many of these people are maybe in their 40s, 30s and 40s, they come from Los Angeles or San Francisco or from Asia, and they want the same lifestyle they would have had there, and they're willing to pay for it. So the expectations of firms was that people would pay €4 for a cappuccino, okay? Okay, so very simple, keeping it very, very simple. And on the left here, we call those injections. Okay? And then we'll get on with the, so I just want to put this on the board first. And then in sophisticated, developed societies like ours, we have things called government, as I was alluding to earlier. Right? Government. And households, as they make money, or see the way I even follow for myself, as they make a return on their factory production, we're taxed on that. It's actually quite, it's like I was talking about climbing the hill or the short mountain. Once you get to the top, it's okay, then it's kind of plain sailing, to be honest with you, unlike physics or maths. And if they ask questions on it, they're very repetitive, and my students have seen of the fact that, how do I teach this? I just teach it through doing the exam problem. And then the government does something which, they take that money, and it's divided, we'll see shortly, it's divided into a number of different parts, but this capital G here is the government deciding to pay public servants like your teachers, nurses, doctors, but also to build the road system or infrastructure in New Lewis in Dublin, as a, my South County Dublin friends say, the Dort. But I remember going to UCD many years ago when I was 17 or 16, and one of my friends, his sister, lovely young woman, his younger sister, and I went down to see them in Dalkey, and she said, "Oh, Barry, did you take the Dort?" "What's the Dort? What's the Dort?" "Dort." I said, "Isn't there an A in there?" She goes, "Oh no, it's South County Dublin, we pronounce the A as O." Right, okay. So that's where the G goes. But be careful here, this is a small aside. This capital G can only, from government, is not the full budget, right? It's only spending by government where a factor of reduction is exchanged, at least inside our toy model. And then we're a small open economy, etc. And then we have the outside world. I'll leave this on the board. And then it's going to get, you will find this maybe quite difficult, I think. So the outside world. And that's where, again, as a lead go to import. I always joke with my students, if an uncle or an aunt gave you 400 euros, or 1,000 euros, would you buy an iPad, or would you buy an iron sweater? So, would you go on, if we didn't have COVID-19 restrictions and you're young, you guys are young, sophisticated, well-educated, would you go to the Aran Islands as on a holiday, or would you go to Paris? So those are imports. Okay. So the richer a country becomes, or the more return households get on their, in exchange for their four factors reduction, we tend to, as a small open economy, we tend to go away, or we tend to buy foreign-made products. Like, for instance, my iPhone, we don't make that in Ireland, do we? Or my iPad, right? Or my shirt, Ralph Lauren, okay? So, and if we're an efficient economy, how do we balance that? Is that, depending on how efficient and productive our workforce is and the kind of products we're making, we should get exports in return. Okay. That's basically, if you can start to understand this in more detail, you see, this is basically, if you follow this as a path to understanding your research economics, and it's definitely H3, not H1. There are other aspects, obviously. You've all heard, factors of reduction. We have to do marginal revenue, productivity of labour, marginal efficiency of capital. But they all actually become quite easy as long as you kind of start to understand this model. Okay? And everything on the right is injections. Okay? And then, just to drive everything, I'll leave that there, our national income concept. Now this becomes very dry, very difficult, because it links with your, just try and regard national income as a theoretical concept, and then a separate subject, as I say to my students, is how do we measure that national income? Because it would be useless to talk about it unless we have some way to measure it. Okay. So when you look at this whole thing, at the end of the day, the wealth of a nation, or the income of a nation, has to be due to returns on those four factors reduction. Okay. And one way to represent that, it's not an equation, we'll call it an identity, and you'll see it in the notes on the website. If national income, this is theoretical, right, equals consumption by households, which is obviously a function of their income. Remember, the national income is basically adding one way of doing it is adding up all the returns on those four factors. Now I know you can't write on the system to my students during the week, and obviously the more we're taxed, our real income will be lower. So for instance, I don't know if any of you have heard of a band called ABBA, right? I have, but maybe you guys haven't. But ABBA would have been one of the most successful pop bands in in the world, okay, in the 70s, let's say, and 80s. They're Swedish, and once they started making more than, let's say, the equivalent of 1 million euros today, they were taxed at 9%. So the marginal rate of tax, so they make 2 million euros. Just say they make 2 million euros over a million. Instead of getting 2 million euros, all they get from that is 200,000 euros. So tax impacts are real income, if that makes sense. So in Ireland, if you add everything up, there are ways around it, but legal ways around it, not illegal, legal ways around it. The more you make, the more PAYE you pay. So, and when you add up all the taxes, USC, PRSI, etc., you probably find that the tax rate in Ireland for somebody at just say 80,000 euros a year is about 50%. Okay, give or take. Plus income by investment by private firms. That's those guys. The mechanism that we do here is through financial institutions. It would take a while to get used to, but it's actually quite. If you start understanding this, then see how we measure national income, etc. That I couldn't remember, but I asked one of the students in maths last week. I said, or at the HMAT, I said, I forget. Last year it was Hamlet for 2020, and I said, what's the 2021 Shakespearean play? And they said King Lear, which I actually far prefer the Hamlet, shorter. Going back to my laziness thing. I said, but learning off the CSO statistics and how it's measured, that's a bit like learning your King Lear quotes. So what I'm trying to do is get you to understand the economic equivalent of the structure of King Lear, and then as we get approach the exam, then we can learn off our quotes, if that makes sense as an analogy. And what's that going to be a function of? Well, the interest rate that financial institutions are willing to charge you, and also expectations for the future. And then once I do this, then you might find what I'm going to do next quite difficult, plus capital G, which is government spending, that guy here, okay, plus exports minus imports. And probably the most important thing, especially for the shorter questions in section A, is what determines our exports and imports. Well, here it's going to be, let's just say for argument's sake, it's going to be the exchange rate. Now, we don't have an exchange rate with our major trading partners, but we'll see shortly, Germany, France, Belgium, Spain, Portugal, because we're all in the Eurozone, but we do with Britain, because they still have sterling. But they're actually quite a small proportion. Our major concern at the moment is our trade with the United States. Okay. So the dollar, euro, also trade tariffs. Okay. I know you guys can't communicate with me because we're a free class, and I don't even know who's on the phone. I could be actually speaking to myself, which is actually quite a common phenomenon for an old person, right? Okay, right. But one thing I will guarantee you guys, if you come to my class next year, you don't have to obviously, is we'll make it a bit of fun. One young lad last year came to me and he liked economics, he got about 60%, and then in his pre's he got 97. Okay? It's all about how do we make the course smaller and try to understand it. So we have to understand King Lear before we can make the quotes. Okay? And students like that. What a lot of students say to me is, no offense to economics teachers, whatever, is they he seems to learn off the quotes without understanding the play. Okay, so I'm going to leave that on the board and I'm going to come back to it back and forth. What I would have liked as a kid is, so this is going to be our Irish economy. Okay. That's our national income, and that's going to be closest to a thing called GNP. More technically, net national product. This is where it gets a bit complicated just from your King Lear quotes. So let us now see if this works. So I'm going to sit down. Now I'm going to go to my iPad. Okay. Now, some of you might not have covered this stuff, but it's a good story, and also it's very relevant. And one of the things I said I think in my descriptor is how do we understand with COVID-19, would you guys be interested to see how COVID-19 has impacted our country up to now, since March 12th? That's what would make it more interesting for me, personally. Okay. Let's hope that's visible for you guys. So that's what I've drawn on the board so far. So national income theoretical considerations. Okay, these are my notes that I use. Hopefully that's visible. Yeah. So isn't that what I've just put on the board? Leakages, injections. Now what I've done here, it should be that I've defined all this. I'm not going to spend much time on. I've already spent a bit of time on the theory. So now guys, so the nice thing about this is then on the next page, I start solving mock papers, the way this stuff comes up, the accent of the exam, right? And I call page, it's A and B, theoretical considerations. Have a read of that first if you can, okay? That's what I've just put on the board, isn't it? So have a read of that, and I'll just give you a few moments to read that. That's basically going back to this equation or identity here, right? Okay. I know it seems very difficult, but it's the key to almost answering all the questions in the exam. Okay. Then you have to just learn about the real world. That's what we'll be doing shortly. So have a read of that, okay? See, when I put together my notes, they're not exhaustive. It's just more, what do we need to know? And then I just assume you guys are very bright. But a lot of students come to me and say, Barry, what on earth is going on, right? Okay. But see that question here, 2018, Leaving Cert Higher. You see, it's hard, I'm not sure this is going to help. So. That's the accent of the exam, see, and that's 20 out of 75, at least in the old form of the exam. But let's go on straight away. Okay. I'll try and use my Apple Pencil here. And again, I can't, you guys can't tell me if you can see this or not, but. So, this is a snapshot of the Irish economy at the end of 2019. And why am I doing this with this free class? Is because you guys have to do a project. I think the project's a very good idea, because I think it will overlap and make your answers to the written exam in June 2021 more sophisticated, okay? So let me just see if I can use my Apple Pencil here. So national income, theoretically, right, equals consumption plus investment by private firms plus government expenditure, as long as the government expenditure has a factor of reduction exchanged. So for instance, that capital G in that equation, or identity, will not include social welfare benefits. Right? Because there's, just say unemployment benefits, social protection, right? Because there's no factor of reduction being exchanged. Child allowances won't be included either. But what will be included though is state pensions, because that is an exchange of income, capital G, for previous factors of production provided. Okay. Plus exports minus imports. Okay? So that's the equation I wrote on the board just recently. You can see that there on the left hand side. Okay. Right. That's our identity, and it's also on page, I don't know, 29 or something of the formulae and tables booklet. Now, one of the things that I would have liked to know as a kid is what is C, what is I, what is G, and what is X and Y. So here we have the economy since 2014, and this is from the Central Statistics Office. Okay. Right. So let's get rid of this. You should. This is on the website, so it should be available to you guys who haven't seen it. So see this number here. That's our C, give or take, right? Broad brush stroke. It's gone up a lot, but not that much of it. Okay. What's our capital G? And capital G is these two numbers together, which is about what? So let's call it 35 plus 7, so 42. Yeah, okay. So that's our G. What's our I? Investment by private brand. See, that's quite nice, isn't it? Right. Now they've all gone up considerably, haven't they? Okay. I hope that makes a little bit more sense. So Irish households spend about 104 billion euros a year. Government, where there's a factor of production exchanged, spends about 42 billion, and private investment is about. Now, can I just a word so wise? This capital I, if you can, it's other than theoretical considerations, try to ignore it in the exam in sense of numbers, because you see there was a massive jump, wasn't there, from 2018 to 2019, and that's due to just the way Ireland works. We're a small open economy, so a lot of that investment would have been. It's just kind of like accountancy stuff. Right. Now forget about this. Now here's the rub. See that line here now, 83 and 84. See, one of my jobs is also to kind of like do the navigation on the Central Statistics. Anybody who's kind of motivated goes onto the Central Statistics Office website, and you just kind of lose the will, just because it's so difficult to interpret. They have an access kind of part to the website to try and help high school kids like you guys. It's absolute rubbish, in my view. I'm sure they don't mean any bad intent. It's just so Ireland exported goods and services 448 billion euros in 2019, and we imported. But let's just focus on this one here, the one in red. Look, guys, this is the way you get a H1 question. Since 2014 to 2019, pre-COVID, so this is the GDP for the end of 2019, we doubled exports. It's far greater than any doubling and far greater than any growth in any of the other numbers there. So one of the reasons that we, at least pre-COVID-19, we had reached full employment, give or take, our economy was going very well. Not for everyone, unfortunately, but for most people, is because of that. So we've had, since the great financial crisis, it's called GFC. I know some of you will find these numbers quite difficult, but it's like climbing the hill. When I was a Boy Scout, we have to do it, okay? Might as well find out now, in late August, rather than in March of 2021, okay? So look, now of course our imports have gone up as well, but we can't make end products without importing goods. So the real growth show here is, the real thing to learn here is, in my view, we've gone from 214 billion
448 billion. So we've doubled exports in 7 years. Okay. Now here's the concept here. Now, so our gross domestic product. I'm not going to kind of bore you. I'm sure you've heard of that in class. So see, we've gone from 195 to 356. And this will be the end of 2019. This is the problem is gross domestic product, according to the Central Statistics Office, is only published once per annum, once per year. Okay? So that's the last viable data point we have. Now, let's just go back here. Again, some of you may not understand this fully, because it's quite theoretical. See, going back to here, enterprise, okay, on the board. That's the four-factor production: land, labour, capital, and enterprise. Right, lads? Fellow Irish and fellow economics students. The return on land is rent. The return on labour is wages. The return on capital is interest, and the return on enterprise is profit. So something that's kind of misunderstood, I think, at times is in this equation here, you see, part of this return on enterprise doesn't go to Irish households. Now, so if you have Google, let's see, I think what does Apple has about 6,000 employees in Ireland, so those employees, so the owners of the land get the rent, right? So they're Irish citizens, let's say, or Irish residents. The labourers or workers get the wages from Google or Apple. Let's assume that to build the plant, they borrowed from Irish banks. So, and when they borrow from Irish banks, that goes back to households via the interest rate due to savings. Enterprise, the profit is the owners of Apple may not be Irish. So the profits don't end up in Irish households. Okay? So it's about like climbing the mountain kind of thing. Once you begin to understand that. So effectively, see that 81 billion euros? There are other contributors to it, but at this point in August, that's the money going back for the profits of multinational corporations in Ireland. That's not going to Irish households. So our GNP is basically this, 274 billion euros. Isn't it nice to have those numbers? But again, look at how we've improved. Now, there is a bit of fluctuation in this series, but over time, that means multinational corporations working in Ireland in 2014 made enough profit from their operations in Ireland, in the Republic, right, not the island of Ireland, the Republic, to send 31 billion euros of profits, so return on enterprise, back to their shareholders outside of Ireland. Now I own Google and Apple, but the vast majority of owners of these enterprises, because they're listed on the New York Stock Exchange or the NASDAQ, etc., the vast majority of owners of those are non-Irish residents. But between 2014 to 2019, basically the distributable profits due to enterprise for operations on the island in Ireland have gone from 30 billion euros to 80 billion. That has been the key to our prosperity. Okay. It doesn't help everybody going back to that economic development. Not everybody feels that way. But can't you see that's a nice way to think about it? Now, see these EU subsidies and EU taxes. They're important. I don't know, but the story seems clear, doesn't it? So what's happened? So we've gone from an economy. Now, I prefer to talk about GDP because that's total economic output in the Republic of Ireland. GNP is basically what's left over for us lads, okay? Right. So we lose that 81 billion, don't we? But without the multinationals, we wouldn't have had the 81 billion to give back. Remember somebody said, gosh, Barry, your tax rate in London must be very high. And I said, well, thank God, because if I didn't have thank God one's in a situation that one can pay income tax, right? So one has the income actually to have a tax bill. Okay. So that's a very important page from the, right, okay. Now here, Let me just kind of like go back to the board now, just briefly. That's what I would have found useful as a kid. And nobody told me this stuff when I was a kid. Let me just clear the board here. Now, I know some of these concepts are very deeply theoretical, but what I'm giving you today should begin to give you, I don't know, a way in to how to answer the project you have to do. It wouldn't surprise me. I still haven't seen the project titles that were going to be asked for you guys to do. It wouldn't surprise me to see something like my master's students at UL discuss the impact on Irish wealth due to COVID-19. That's the thesis I'm helping students at UL study at the moment, okay? Now, I'm not a deeply theoretical economist. My background would be theoretical physics, pure maths. And then, once I decided not to do academic, then I ended up, for my sins, running hedge funds and investment banks, and then the mathematical and economic and market strategies for companies like Nomura, World Bank of Canada, some of the world's largest hedge funds. Okay. Right. So I'm kind of more a practical economist, but I love the theory only as long as it helps me make decisions. So going back to our why equals private consumption by household. They will ask you potentially to draw this, but I draw on the right. And you have to make sure you've got the leakages and injections correctly. Plus investment by private firms, and that's this here. Okay. Investment is when firms make a decision to buy capital goods, such as robot arms or. Okay. And so they invest in capital, and it's an investment. So the board of directors, whatever the company decides to expand their operations, a BMW decides to build a factory in Indonesia or something, or Vietnam, okay? Plus government spending, which is dependent on the political mandate of the government in power, plus exports minus imports. Okay? So here's the first thing I want to do. So looking at our data here, I won't go back to it. So that's about 100 billion. Well, I bet you nobody's shown you this, but actually blooming numbers on them. Okay, blooming numbers on them. That's about 100 billion. Okay. See? And this Y here is the closest thing. We'll have to get nuances later on, but that's closest to GNP. More accurately, net national product to do with depreciation, etc. But let's not worry about that at the moment. And then, finally, so expenditure by government is about 42 billion. It's a nice way to think about it, isn't it? Actual numbers. Remember, this economics is about studying a living organism called our global economy, right? It's not like solving a quadratic equation. We're actually looking at the real economy. So, and sometimes 40% of the marks for questions are just knowing about 20 numbers. Fixed capital formation in Ireland was about 162 billion euros. This is all 2019 data. But look, do you ever hear that expression? Maybe you're too young. The elephant in the drawing room. So you have all these very grand, like Downton Abbey or something, all these grand ladies and gentlemen with their porcelain fine bone china sipping their tea and having kind of like cucumber sandwiches in this fabulous drawing room. And behind them is this, like me, this huge elephant like destroying everything. So the elephant in the drawing room for the Irish economy, now if you think about this, is as follows. Exports are 448 billion euros, including goods and services. So that's final merchandise, final manufactured products, and all services that we sell to the rest of the world. So it's 10 times our government expenditure. Now, our imports, obviously imports and exports should be related. If I'm producing, final end, high-end products like inorganic chemicals, then I need to import the basic products, don't I? And that's about 405 billion euros. And this is as of 2019.
This is a very popular question. Anybody comes to my class realize it's a very popular question on Ireland is a small open economy. Discuss the implications. Okay, 20 or 30 marks. One of my students said it so beautifully. Actually, I'm so impressed. I use the analogy all the time. She said, "Barry, as long as my economic argument is valid, do I get the marks?" And I said, "Absolutely." So that gives you a screenshot, doesn't it? And when you all add up all those, you get approximately 350 billion euros, which at the end of 2019 is what we call GDP. And then about 80 billion euros of that goes back to households which are not Irish. See, the way you keep it simple, just get the kind of like, I don't know, the story right, then it becomes quite easy. And when I subtract that out, I get about 270. Is that right? Yeah. And that's the difference between GDP. GDP is a measure of all output in a certain given period of time, a year in the Irish case, for all economic output that occurs in the Republic of Ireland. For all economic players. GNP is a measure of the, I don't know, I suppose the way to say it, what only goes to Irish households. So if you're some kind of like rich person sitting there in Santa Barbara, in Southern California, in mid California, and you've got a large shareholding in Apple, some of the profits that are made by Apple in Ireland go to your bank account, not to an Irish national bank account. That's all that's really going on. And we've got a fancy word for that. Net factor income from abroad. You might have seen that kind of weird word. Isn't that nice though? At least we've put together the Irish economy at the end of 2019. And if you do little calculations, as in my handout, I won't do it here. So household consumption is about 38%. Now it's interesting. Private household consumption in the United States would be about 70%. So what's happening here is the Irish households have less of an impact, okay? Now, I think that's very important to understand. Now I'm going to show you, now that's, now look at this here. Again, none of you are in the classroom with me, so now I'm going to erase some of this, okay? So one young woman about a year ago, came up to me and she said, "Barry, so many numbers to learn off by heart. How am I going to do it?" And I went, "Would you say about 24 numbers? Would that say 30 numbers?" It's an awful lot. And I said, "Well, economics course, it's about looking at the real economy, isn't it? Connecting these the abstract ideas would be useless unless they helped us kind of like government policy making or how to make a loads of money, as some of my colleagues in London would say." And she said, "Barry, 24 to 30 numbers, that's an awful lot to learn off." And I said, "Well, over 2 years, isn't that approximately one a month?" And she looked at me and I looked at her, she looked back at me and she started to laugh and she goes, "Oh." Right, one number a month. Right? One number a month. It's not that big an ask, I think. Okay? Right. Excuse me. Have another wipe. Let's get rid of some of these numbers now. Well, I'll leave those there. Just realize why here is effectively what we're doing is we're subtracting out the profits made by multinational corporations in Ireland. So multinational corporations are very useful for us because they pay rent, they pay labour, they pay capital, and it's just the fact that some of the profits go back to households which aren't Irish. That's all that's going on, right? So it's less. And that's what we call net factor income from abroad, or NFIA, okay? Right. So COVID-19 occurred. So while I'm doing that, just have a read of this page here if you can. Remember in economics, we've got two concepts. Wealth and income are very different concepts. So have a read of that. And look what's happened to, think about if you said to your mom or dad, or your uncle or aunt, over dinner what they would measure as their wealth. Right? Without being rude and asking them for specific details, in other words, what do you think they'd say a measure of their wealth would be? Okay. And this is where it becomes interesting, in my view. I know this is kind of a fast track introduction to. So we have to be very careful here. And again, what a lovely way to be introduced to these awful concepts. So household wealth is different from a household income. And then I'll have to accelerate a bit because we're about half an hour left. From household income, right? So, as an individual like myself, older than you guys, so no mortgage, own property, my sins, thankfully. The London and Los Angeles thing paid off, kind of, right? Pensions. My pensions would be tied up in, I use Lansdowne, Hargraves in London, for my pensions, but most Irish people use Irish Life or Zurich Life or something. So it doesn't apply to all households. Remember, we're talking about an aggregate in total. About 70% of all households where the occupants of the households are over 45 years of age have private pensions to supplement their state pensions. So what we saw was the stock market collapsed February, and believe me, I was following this. I did rather well with my little bit of money that I was investing. And it collapsed, but it came right back, as you see in the first graph here. So therefore, household wealth has not been, from a point of view of you. So for me, what would I, of course, all Irish citizens own all the factors of production in the country, but also all the state assets. So to an extent, we all own, inverted commas, the ESB, the national grid, the dams, the roads, the postal service or whatever. But realistically and simplistically, if I think about my wealth, it would be, wealth inverted commas, would be my pensions, which are kind of an indication, I think, to an extent by this graph here. People don't, economics is not taught this way, and it should be. So, you can imagine anybody with a private pension feels a bit relieved, because a lot of their private pension would be in equities. But you can imagine when we reach this point, in mid-March, people were rather unrelieved, okay? And then, what's the other thing? Savings, obviously, but what's the other thing that most, not all Irish households, we do have an awful lot of people who are in economic distress, and that's one of the other aims of government. Remember, economic development is to try and, I go out for a walk, just say along a Colin Strand, right? And beautiful footpaths, beautiful views over the River Shannon. But those footpaths have to be paid by someone. They should be paid by me. Or people who have been lucky enough to not have to worry about going to Dunn's Stores or something. So So economic development is about making sure that people are lucky enough to be able to benefit from the footpaths, etc., and the infrastructure, basically, that we give something back to the people who are less fortunate. Right? So the other aspect of so as a property owner, and your parents as well, is we haven't seen any significant contraction in household in property prices. So wealth in the country up until now, and these are very high frequency data. You can see they're actually quite from last week, aren't they? So all the data in here is as close as possible to the recent statistical measures. So household wealth has not fallen. But let's look here. Right? Now, this is going to be an interesting story, right? And I won't have time to complete it fully, but I bet you guys something like this would really, really help in your project. And the way I do the project is 7 pages, or 8 pages, relatively little writing, graphs, come to a conclusion, and then the other kind of like the filler will be expanding on your argument. So you come to the conclusion quite quickly. So here's my conclusion so far, is that so far at least, COVID-19 has not impacted household wealth in Ireland. In other words, people sitting there going, wake up in the morning and go, my pension's okay, for whatever reason, my house hasn't collapsed in price. Right? First conclusion. Now, what about, now, there's a difference now between wealth, okay, just going back to our thing on the board, wealth and national income. Okay. Going back to my silly example of Downton Abbey, right? Big house, so lots of wealth, right? But no income. Okay. So there's a difference in economics between the idea of wealth and income. Wealth is the asset you own, income is your continuous income stream, or continuous cash flow stream. See, that's a very abstract concept in economics that I would have hated at your age, but if I could have presented it that way, I think I'd feel more comfortable in opining on it. Okay? Ultimately, if income falls, if income keeps on falling in Ireland, everyone's going to get out of town, so the assets will fall. So house prices will fall because nobody will want to buy it, and nobody will have the income in order to get the mortgage to buy your house, right? So, but in the short run, i.e., if we assume COVID-19 is going to be a 12 to 24 month phenomenon, then nothing's really changed, okay? Which is intriguing. Also, the stock market, which is, remember, Ireland's, what did I say, about a 200, gross national product wise, about a 250 billion euro economy. But the United States is $15 trillion, which is 15,000 billion. Okay. China and Japan kind of come second, about 5 billion euros each. Germany is probably, so Japan would be, let's give or take, the second largest economy in the world. Give or take with China. And then we have countries like Germany, which would be about 2 trillion euros, so 2,000 billion. So you can see Ireland's very, very small, by definition. But there's only 5 million of us, right? Give or take. Again, one of the numbers you need to know. What's the population of the European Union ex-UK? It's about 430 million citizens. So these are kind of numbers that the young woman said to me about if I need to know. It's just kind of like ways of just kind of calculating these things, just understanding the experiment rather than just the theory. In fact, actually, when I was your age, once I started to understand the data, it made the theory less of a bitter pill to digest. Okay. So wealth hasn't changed. But what about here? Now, remember we talked about here, remember our consumption here? I always use this example. Just say you're a city banker in London, right? So a city banker in London. have your smart 2-bedroom apartment in Chelsea, you have your little Porsche 911 or whatever outside, and just say you make, very, very important, just say you make, and I know it sounds weird, just say you make 500,000 euros a year. I'm really making this, very few people can achieve that in our capitalist societies, but just say you make 500,000 euros. Okay. So your consumption, your real income is very high. Maybe give or take 250,000 or sterling. It's called euros. But if you think you might lose your job, very important, it's very stark, but it's the way that economics works. Will you save more than you consume? Especially if you think it's the last time you'll make 500,000 euros. See, so our consumption is divided between, that C is divided between savings and actually, see, if I thought I was going to make 500,000 euros a year for the rest of my life, then you'd consume, you'd go on your holiday to, pre-COVID-19 at least, to Italy or France, or, you've got a friend who's got a birthday party in New York, and you just go, no problem, I'll fly out on Friday and come back Sunday morning or something. So, consumption is about confidence. So, looking here, and by the way, this is actually, it looks like a long document, but this is the story of our society. Right? And some of the conclusions are quite weird. So, this is a measure here, guys, if I can read it correctly, of Irish consumer confidence. Anything less than 100 means more people are less confident. So during the height of COVID-19, you see they had fallen already because of Brexit. But look at the collapse in consumer confidence. So it reached something like 60 from this. Actually 40, should I say. Now we're back to 60. Going back to here, people are reluctant to consume. They're not confident about the future. So just like our little banker example here, I'm going to go batten down the hatches. When you go to Tesco buy, or you go to Lidl, or rather than Tesco, as a single person, or something like that. You're just not confident about the future. You don't replace your car, right? Okay. So that has to have a negative impact on future consumption. Again, I can't ask you if that makes sense because I don't know who's listening to me, if anybody. Okay. So that's quite an interesting graph, isn't it? So Irish consumer confidence has collapsed. Absolutely collapsed. There's a slight rebound. What about Irish retail sale? What about unemployment? And again, that's going to influence us, isn't it? So for your 2021 exam, I'd be very careful about this. Going back to, remember I said earlier, goals of government. There are different ways, and going back to how we measure these statistics. So this is actually from the end of July 2020. I'm a terrible geek, aren't I? Going and finding all this data. So we have a traditional unemployment rate, which is still about 5%, which is very, very low. But look at what the Central Statistics Office. See, the reason why the traditional unemployment rate is still 5% is the payouts to actually real unemployed people. It's a different government mechanism to supplement the income of approximately 700,000 Irish people who have been affected by COVID-19. So in June 2020, we had 23.1% equivalent unemployment rate. That's unprecedented in the history of the state. Now let's come back to about 16.7% because we reopened in July. That is what the Central Statistics Office is saying the unemployment rate now is 17% at the end of July. Just a mere 3 weeks ago. That's a disaster, potentially. Right? So, how did the Irish government fund this? Now, this is a difficult, I understand, a difficult analysis for you guys. So, if I was employed and I looked at that number, I wouldn't be confident about the future. So I'd start consuming less. And if I consume less, then national income falls, right? Okay. So there are two questions here, and this could be your project next year. And if it isn't, we're going to shoehorn it in anyway. Okay, so at least as we stand, household wealth for people over 40 years of age has been relatively stable during the COVID-19 crisis. The real unemployment rate, COVID-19 adjusted, is 20%, let's say. At the height of the great financial crisis, from 2010, let's say, the unemployment rate in Ireland reached 18% at its height. That's gone from 18% down to 5%, just say, by February 2021. But look, see that's an absolute disaster. And that's not just youth unemployment, that's every single person in the workforce. And that goes back to, again, learning off your King Lear, okay? You'll get used to the definitions later. But the story is important. Okay. Now, what's happened to retail sales? But what's happened is we have that kind of COVID-19 adjusted unemployment rate, okay? And again, you'll have to get, it's like your King Lear quote, you'll have to get good at that. But look at retail sales. This is very, very intriguing to me, is retail sales, and let's look graphically.
We'll include all businesses, right? So we'll be looking at the blue curve rather than the green.
So, we had a collapse. So we had some kind of base of 120, and then we went to 60 during lockdown.
That's retail sales. So you can imagine our government is, like most governments in the Western world, very, very dependent on VAT receipts. And I'll be showing you, again, just get a feel for the numbers. So if you read the papers, they close it down there and go, oh my God, everything's over. And that goes back to our C, doesn't it? That's the consumption on the top left-hand corner. See? So it would have fallen from 100 billion to 70 billion. So it would be wipe out of 30 billion, annualized.
But what they don't tell us is the latest data set. Seems to, once the economy reopened, we had pent-up demand and we had a dramatic rebound in retail sales. Now that could be just pent-up demand, couldn't it? I remember, again, anecdotes in economics they're not always important, but they're not irrelevant. After lockdown stopped, and I'd be walking into Kilmartins, to get a few online classes or whatever, and the lines outside Pennies would be enormous. Okay? Not so much outside. There was no lines outside Brown Thomas, for instance. So there's obviously some kind of pent-up demand. Now, maybe that collapses going forward, guys, but that's quite a dramatic rebound, isn't it? Back to the same level. So, now, definitely the Irish government has lost VAT receipts, and the economy has lost economic activity due to here. But the point is we've rebounded.
Okay? Now, now this gets a bit more theoretical, and we've still got 15 minutes, so I'm surprised how much progress we've made. How does a government, like the Irish government, make up for the falling consumption? So first of all, what do? They show you here. That's how we spend our fiscal budget. Okay. That's our spending. So what they do, they increase social protection. That was the helping people out who might be COVID-19, so they don't get fired. See, from the government's point of view, they'd far prefer to go like maybe subsidise private businesses, not to fire their workers, and subsidise them, and instead of them coming on the live register on the labour force survey. So what's happened here is, I know this is a complicated story, but it's a complicated story, but it's like climbing that hill I mentioned. So that obviously that's gone up, hasn't it? So that will be COVID-19, so social protection. And obviously due to the virus, we've had to increase enormously, our health spending. Okay. Now imagine you're making 100,000 euros a year. But temporarily, you need to spend 130,000 euros per say, you own a house or whatever. So the 100,000 euros covers all your costs. You know, your mortgage, maintenance of the house, kids' fees, all the rest of after tax. Just say someday, for some reason, your insurance won't cover it, and you need 30,000 euros to rebuild your roof or something. Just temporarily, right? That's 30,000 more than you're making, so you're going to have to borrow that from somewhere. So that's what the Irish government is facing. So we have to borrow to pay for increased social protection. That will be the COVID-19 payments. And extra health care, right? Should be here. Also, we need in some way to stimulate the economy going forward. So it's all a game of timing. It's all a game of, I so pity the number of people who have lost their lives, etc., have been struck down by this awful virus. But the government still has to make decisions. So I think this is very important. See the way I'm introducing, and this is a government, this is from the Department of Finance, right? So with all this spending for 2020, we're looking at a 30 billion euro deficit. What do you mean by that? That means the government will be spending in 2020 will be spending 30 billion euros that it's actually bringing in. Okay. Nice story, I think. Now if you have to do your roof, who's going to lend you the money? You're going to have to pay the people building the roof. You're going to have to pay them cash, right, or give them a check. So you're going to have to borrow the money from somewhere. Similarly, even though it's a national economy like Ireland, if we're spending 30 billion euros, then our income, right, then we're going to have to borrow the money from somewhere. And where do we borrow? We borrow from the international financial markets. Yeah. I don't know who's on the phone, obviously, but what's interesting is the international markets don't seem to give it. They actually seem to believe in us. So there are two questions here: is collapse in Irish wealth and mitigating the impact of COVID-19 on economic output. In other words, your capital Y in the theoretical equation on the board, right? So going back here to Y. Here, right? Difficult. I know this is difficult this morning, guys, for you guys. But see, if it comes up in your project, then we're in a strong position, I think. And can you see that it should kind of like it should flow back into your ability to answer the theoretical questions in the written paper in a more sophisticated way. How can we do that, though? Just for a few minutes, okay? This is something kids don't like, the banking aspect of things.
So to try to explain this, right? Please, if you can go back to school. So the government claims they're going to spend 30 billion euros more than they would have. Okay. Think about that. It means, see, as we see from the data here, just go back here. You do have to start getting a feel. You don't have to know all this stuff off by heart. But look, the 2020 fiscal budget. Do you see how much is included with? See that 21 billion on the left? That won't be included in capital G, right? Because that's money provided for no return on the factor production. That's H1 kind of stuff, guys. Okay. So that's an example of where all our income comes from to actually fund that 80 billion euros of projected spending. Okay. Right. So what the government has done is the government's trying to take here. They're going to spend an extra 30 billion. Right. And the question is, how much will Y fall? So in other words, to stop social chaos, the government spent 30 billion. What is a loan? A basic loan, just for the government. That's all you have to understand for the economics course. Right? And some of you have heard this before, but it's very important. In fact, actually, it's vitally important. Okay. Let me just write this up and just get a white pen. What does this interest rate mean? And I'll use big numbers because that's what the kind of like numbers the government's going to have to borrow. Okay. So what's a billion euros? It's 1,000 million in case we forget. I actually think it's simple things like that that I may not have remembered as a kid. Would have had hesitation. So, where to distinguish this? Just say I borrow 1 million euros from the bank, and I'm the Irish government. So we'll call that Irish government bonds. This will sound weird, but it's not, again, it's like climbing that hill as a Boy Scout. It's not actually that bad. Just say somebody gives me a loan, just say a French banker lends the Irish government for 10 years. €1 million. I'm making up these numbers at 5%. What does that mean? It's very important. It means the Irish government, what are the implications of that is, if the Irish government decides to accept that offer, right? For 10 years, what it means, let's call it 5 years, so I can actually draw it on the board without boring you guys. So, what's 10% of 1 million? It's 100,000. What's 5%? It means every year for 5, so this is time, this is amount, so how much money I have to pay the French banker. At the end of year 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. End of year 1, I need to pay the French banker 50,000. Yeah? Same at the end of year 2, end of year 3, end of year 4. At the end of year 5, I need to pay him 50,000 and also the €1 million back. That's what a government bond looks like in our modern economy. Yeah? Now, I'm just making up this 5%. So look what the markets have done. So we've told the world economy, all the French bankers, the American bankers, the German bankers, the Japanese bankers, the Chinese bankers, Vietnamese, Egyptian, lads in Dublin, right? We've told them that we think we might have to borrow 30 billion more to spend than we're making in this current year. And they have been completely happy with that. They're completely happy with that. And that's the example of the interest rate. Don't worry about the negatives. That's just what we're working in. You know? In other words, the market knows we'll probably have to spend 30 billion more than we're making in 2020, but they have no problem with it. So happy days. There is no reason why the Irish government can't expand its deficit. Of course, it does push us further into debt, and we're one of the most indebted countries in the world. But I think that's so. Question one is: will the international markets allow Ireland to run a deficit, going to pay for social protection and also healthcare spending? Yes. Yes. At least now. At least now. Now, let's just before we go, I think that's a very useful graph, by the way. Students don't fully understand I'm just going to put it at 2. Students don't fully understand that. Going back to that young, very, very clever, very smart young woman, junior leaving cert with me, and she said, there's so many numbers to remember. I said, no, there's not money. It's far better, you need about 24 numbers. That's 1 a month for the 2 years you do your economics course. I think that's far better than the number of quotes you need for 6 poets on your English course, 6 poems each. So I think it's and this does really differentiate between an H3 and an H1. But it's a hard learning plan, isn't it? Yeah. Now let's have a look, just before we go, let's have a look at our exports. Here's the most amazing thing. This doesn't make much sense to me. Wouldn't you think, like Japan just came out last week, Nippon came out last week with a total collapse in their export markets. Ireland, and you see the way how recent this data is. June 2020. Our exports went up. Amazing. So what I tried to put together here for you guys, and imports fell, but let's just regard exports by themselves. So, our exports here are not so much different than here. In fact, our exports of merchandise, so that means manufactured, are industrial goods, basically. Even given the collapse in our hospitality industry, tourism, why is that? See, that's where you get the H1, and you don't have to actually say an awful lot about it. Is that's the composition of Ireland's exports. Remember that growth I had earlier, and then I'll let you go because it's a very long conversation. Go back to page 1. See, we went from 214 billion to 448 billion. An awful lot has to do with pharmaceuticals. Pharmaceuticals being the part of the industrial base of Ireland which produces medication. So for whatever reason, see, we don't produce cars or ships or airplanes. We actually produce, and we also produce a lot of computers, or at least parts required in the final production of computers. So we seem to have swerved, at least to now, we seem to have swerved a major disaster. Because, so our exports have fallen, they've actually increased since the same period of last year. I'd say we're the only industrial economy in the world that's done that. And it's probably a lot rather than brains. But look what's happened to our major trading competitors, our trading partners. So the United States will be, so that's a nice graph as well, especially if you're doing your project.
That's from the CSO as well. I'm a terrible geek, aren't I? But look what's happened in the UK. In the second quarter, which means GDP, or just say basic output of an economy, fell 20%. United States, in the second quarter, that what I mean from that is the beginning of April to the end of July, fell 30%. That's from the Federal Reserve data. And our European partners in the European Union, they claim down 12%. In the United it's far higher. But look here, that's the real numbers. Second quarter versus first. So here's the dilemma. How come our exports haven't collapsed? So, an hour and a half, we did a bit of theory, and I think just knowing that story here would be very, very useful. Not even if it's a different question that's asked in your project. I think it's H1, and it gives you an example of how to potentially put the data together to actually. You need an argument. You need a, just say this is what I'm trying to do. This is what I'm exploring. Then you could give fluff about basically what's happened historically, etc. And you say, this is where we currently stand. And actually, I'm quite surprised. I agree with Professor Tinsler that at least as we currently stand, except for collapse in domestic consumption, we have not seen the collapse that one would expect with such a huge contraction in the economic output of the nations or regions of the world that we trade with. Listen, guys. All I can say is that might have appeared rather deep and theoretical, but no, it's just a story, isn't it? I had a friend in London many years ago, very, very good Irish guy, and very clever, and he said, sure, you could have a few drinks, you go, sure, Barry, never let the facts get in the way of a good story, right? From Dublin, from, Black Rock College and all that kind of stuff, and I said, when people say that to me, yes, perhaps when we're at a party, but in the cold light of day, the facts I just gave you seem to indicate that we've, so far, we've weathered the crisis quite well. Quite surprisingly, I'm quite shocked by the resilience of Irish exports. But it's probably due to the composition of our exports. Our trading partners are falling apart. Now, here's the question if you were asked this as a project. Could we maintain this for long? No. Can we maintain it for a year? Yes. If we went to 2 years with lockdown or whatever, then we're in problem. It doesn't mean along the way there aren't casualties, i.e. the old who have succumbed to the disease, the young who will succumb to the disease. But surprisingly, due to the composition of our industrial base, we haven't been as affected as much as I was pessimistic about. And that would be very valuable as your project, if it so happens that the question is answered. So what I just showed you, and I think that would be very good for your project. Now I can help you with the project. Obviously, my students who might be online, the students who come to me since 5th year, but it also has to be your own voice. It can't be my voice. It has to be your voice. Okay, good. Listen, lovely. Maybe I've spoken for an hour and a half to myself, which is not unusual, but please try and enjoy the rest of your week. Some of you who do come to my classes, I sent you over the weekend a pre going back to school mathematics pack. As they say, I want them done. Okay. Have a good one. Bye guys. How do I turn this off?